Yeah, it is incredible if you look around at hunter-gatherer populations or some of the quote-unquote blue zones around the world, or places where we have the most centenarians, and movement and physical activity is just baked into the cake of how their daily living, and you see 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds and how they move in some of these areas, and it's in stark contrast to what you'd see in most of the quote-unquote developed countries, whether you're in the UK, Canada, US, a lot of places in Europe. And so that movement piece is massive. And obviously you've done a lot of work with your previous work and your PhD with muscle weakness, which is, again, as you've touched on, a big part of the issue here, because if we're getting weaker as we get older, we're more likely to have falls. As we've talked about previously, the cost in terms of the healthcare system is in the billions. It's just incredible. And, as you mentioned, once you get past the age of, well, even 40, but especially 50 onwards, that rate of muscle loss starts to increase. Can you talk a little bit about this connection between, muscle weakness, longevity, and quality of life, and some of the things that you uncovered in your work?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you mentioned, when I did my PhD, it was surrounding musculoskeletal science, exercise physiology, and nutrition all in one in a clinical trial, really. But it was focused on muscle and sarcopenia, and I moved into the bone field as well. So I'm working with Professor Gustavo Duque, who's both a biomedical scientist and he's actually a clinician as well. So he's very much from bench to bedside, but he now has introduced me to this concept of a bone as well. So he's teaching me. That's basically why I moved halfway across the world to learn more about osteosarcopenia. But yeah, going
Incredible.
back to my PhD was focused just on muscle loss, on muscle weakness and sarcopenia. So we ran a clinical trial, and what we did was we wanted to see, really, it was the biggest one done in the UK so far, and there was a lack of trials done where we took a group of older adults who were physically inactive at the time. They were predisposed to muscle weakness, muscle loss. They were on a downward trajectory and at risk of falls and fractures. And we wanted to see what happens when you provide them, resistance exercise alone, or you give another group resistance exercise plus a higher intake of protein. And then what happens as well for those individuals who, let's say, for some reason they can't engage in physical activity. We wanted to see, can protein alone preserve muscle loss and muscle weakness across a certain time period. So we also had a protein group alone. And then we had a control group, which unfortunately for them, once they're randomized to that group, they don't get any intervention. So just to reiterate there, we had a control group who did nothing. We took a group that did physical activity, resistance exercise. Then we took a group that did physical activity plus a higher intake of protein, and then a group that took protein alone. And we did a battery of measures at baseline, and that was in terms of muscle mass measures. It was in terms of upper and lower body muscle strength measures. Then we looked at their electrical activity of the muscle as well, of different muscles, their upper limb and lower limb. And that was through electromyography, so EMG. You look at how well they can fire those muscles before and after these treatments. And we also looked at some cardiovascular outcomes as well. We looked at blood markers, cholesterol levels, hormones, lots of different things. Now, the end result of that trial showed that an improvement in both muscle health in terms of the amount of mass, the strength, the electrical capacity of the muscle, all increased in these individuals that were previously inactive. And after the intervention, they substantially improved their muscle health, and then were at a reduction of falls and fractures. And we didn't show in that trial that the added the protein alone group, their muscle mass and their strength didn't change, whereas the control group actually went down. So there's some suggestive there that, or some suggestions that the protein intake alone was able to preserve over a period of 4 months,
Mm-hmm.
preserve their muscle mass and the strength of that tissue. It just didn't change in comparison to the control group. They lost leg strength. And remember, this is a very well controlled randomized clinical trial. So there's quite good evidence there now, and from other studies, that, as I mentioned from the start, if you perform resistance exercise and you take in more protein, you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck in terms of muscle mass and strength in comparison to resistance exercise alone. And then maybe perhaps if you, for some reason, you're bedbound or you have another clinical condition and you can't do exercise, a higher intake of protein definitely for muscle metabolism is going to protect what you have there in terms of the contractile proteins, which you need every day just to for mobility, to move around, get out of a chair, climb up a stairs for an older adult, make sure that they don't slip over a curb or something and get a fracture, you know?
Yeah, that's obviously even seemingly more timely as well under the current situation with COVID-19 and people being homebound and not moving as much and not going to the gym as much or getting their resistance exercise in, and perhaps likely their nutrition changing as well with if they weren't getting enough protein in to start with, if their meal frequency has come down or they're not consuming enough, this is sort of adding on to the problem a little bit. And Ben, when we look at the evolution of research in this area, where is your research going? Where is the field going in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I can briefly tell you, just maybe touching on where I'm going from this going forward, the studies that I have lined up. So we have just got access to an American database called Mr. Oz. So it's a longitudinal trial in older men between the ages of 70 to 80, and we track their muscle and bone every 3 months for over that time period. And it also looks at the amount of hospitalization, falls, and fractures over that time period. And we're very interested in, when we look at bone loss and muscle loss, so osteoporosis and sarcopenia, and that leads to osteosarcopenia, which one occurs first? Does somebody lose bone and then they lose muscle and then they develop osteosarcopenia? Or is it they lose muscle mass first and then bone and then they lead to osteosarcopenia? Now, when we look at the percentage of muscle loss and bone loss across the lifespan, it would suggest that bone loss occurs at a slower rate. So that would suggest that sarcopenia actually develops first before osteoporosis and then leads on to osteosarcopenia. And that hypothesis as well comes from, if you take an individual and throw them into a bed for 10 days and make sure that they don't move at all, we know that they'll lose more muscle mass over that time period than they will bone. But what we're trying to do, obviously, is establish the evidence of this in an older adult cohort. So I'm going to be looking at a life course approach, basically, from the ages of 70 up to maybe 90. And we're going to look at the transition rates of people losing muscle and bone and leading to osteosarcopenia. And then we're going to look at as well how many falls and fractures they've had and hospitalizations throughout that year. And we're also going to be looking at what biomarkers, so in terms of hormones, are linked to muscle and bone loss and linked to osteosarcopenia at this stage. So that's one of the epidemiological studies that I'm working on with the National Institute of Health on Aging, and with a collaborator, Peggy Cawthorne, from a university in San Francisco medical department. And then I'm going to be running 2 different clinical trials, one of them looking at a pharmacological marker to see if it can, or pharmacological compound to see if it can improve muscle and bone mass in osteosarcopenic patients and reduce falls and fractures. And I'm also going to be looking at a nutritional cocktail, if you want to call it, or a supplement, which has benefits, we hope for benefits for both muscle and bone. And this is in randomized double-blind clinical trials in patients that are diagnosed with osteosarcopenia. And then we look at the very important outcomes as well in terms of falls and fractures. So that's what health policy want to know. They don't particularly want to know, if you put an individual on this intervention, do they increase their muscle mass, their strength, and their bone mass? Mm-hmm. But they want to know the hard outcomes in terms of hospitalizations, falls, fractures, cost benefit. Does this compound, pharmaceutical or nutritional compound, does it work on ultimately reducing falls, fractures, mortality rates in these individuals? And that's then going forward, we can try translate that into health policy. I can't really mention what those drug compounds are. Or
can we twist your arm here?
No, nutritional beverage, but it's probably along the lines of what my recommendations are. or what I've talked about on so far. So there, basically, that's one from an epidemiological study, and then there's one from a double-blind clinical trial that I'm going to be going ahead with in the next few months.